Next up, we have our impact panel on building for impact, global, local solutions to global problems. We've got Daniel moderating with Chris, Shuya, Amreen, and Scott. Please take it away. Looking forward to what y'all have to say.
Hi, so we'll be talking about impact and its relation to the crypto and blockchain world. So I'm Daniel. I work in blockchain infra and climate and a lot of other impact areas. I cut my teeth in crypto doing remittances in the Philippines in 2013. But yeah, I'd love to maybe go down the line and do name, maybe current role or current project that you guys have been working on, and maybe like a brief background. That'd be great. So Scott.
Awesome. All right, I'll try and speak a bit louder, just given the audience. My name's Scott. I work on a project called Gitcoin. I co-founded that with Owaki back in 2017.
Closer.
And ultimately, the goal of Gitcoin is to find a way to coordinate around shared needs for any given community, any local community, using primarily this tool called quadratic funding. The idea of quadratic funding is, in short, that if you have a set of voters in a system, you can use the signal of their donations to allocate larger pools of philanthropic capital from governments or from nonprofits towards a given set of local causes. So that can be things like open source. It could be causes like climate. And to date, we've done about $50 million plus through that mechanism. Beyond that, I steward a bunch of DAOs beyond Gitcoin itself, which I think is just part of being a good steward of the ecosystem.
Awesome. Hey everyone, my name is Amreen. I work at UNICEF as a product manager, particularly within the Office of Global Innovation. UNICEF's mandate is to advance human rights for children, and make sure that they can meet their potential. And one way that the Office of Innovation does that is by identifying and scaling solutions that can really advance children's needs. And within that team, I fall under ventures where we look at building 0 to 1 products that leverage technologies like AI, Web3, and so on in order to create that social impact. We've been doing some projects in the Web3 space. We've collaborated with Gitcoin, so would love to share more about the work as the panel moves along. I'll pass it over to you.
Hey all, my name is Shuya Gong. I'm currently a design director at IDEO and got my start in 2015. We were working with really large financial institutions as they had this curiosity around what would blockchains do for the future of large financial infrastructure. And as we were doing this exploration, it actually turned out that it was much more interesting to see where blockchain technologies and the Web3 stack could be applied to places that are currently unbanked and currently don't have any financial infrastructure. So around 5 years ago, with the Bill Gates Foundation, we launched Last Mile Money, which was an exploration to see what this cash in, cash out in rural unbanked areas would look like and what it looks like to really start to get into the mobile money market. Currently in DAO space, I contribute to Refi DAO, just to understand what the tools for working towards a regenerative economy looks like, as well as with We3, where we're working with early seed stage startups who are building the future of the internet, looking at product and strategy design. Pass it to Chris.
Hey all, can you hear us? Okay, good. My name is Chris Krohn. I'm an executive director and founder of BXC, which is Blockchain Times Climate Leadership Network. We're a nonprofit organization that brings together leading L1s, dApps, and projects, looks to organize, synthesize, and build taxonomies, education, and understanding across these groups. And then we drive into Web 2 applications, so driving into industry pilots, tests, and MVP builds, to really build capacity and understanding of how the traditional industry and enterprise world can adopt and work with blockchain and Web3 technology.
Great. So I think what would be really helpful is like, let's do like a contrast from a lot of the impact work that a lot of these folks have been contributing to in the crypto and blockchain ecosystem, and perhaps like the more of the ideological roots of how crypto had started. As an example, right, I used to work at a law firm and I rage quit, started mining Bitcoin in 2013 to like take down the banks, right? And now it's funny, Rick, we simp over banks coming into crypto, but now we've had like, let's say 10 plus or so years engaging in some of the more qualitative and, no pun intended, impactful aspects of blockchain, right? There's this sort of like resurgence of these spectrums that we've come across. I'd be really interested, maybe from each of you guys, to see like how let's say the hype or the popularity of these types of initiatives that maybe crypto had started off with are getting a foothold or need to get more of a foothold in this age of DeFi and shitcoins and like Ponzi-nomics and stuff like that, right? Like, as an example, I met Chris in Greenland on like watching glaciers melt, and then that's how a lot of like the initiatives of like the blockchain climate leadership network started. And I think that was like something that got a lot of people more closely involved with why they're building in blockchain and crypto. Of course, you need to have like this incentivization of this good behavior that we all are benefiting from, but I think like right there definitely is a place for ideology where I think impact definitely aligns with more. So maybe if you have like an example of like what was your Tyler Durden moment? Like what specifically from an ideological perspective was moving you for like the impact specifically under the climate space, the impact in crypto space? Yeah.
I think for me, a lot of it comes back to the idea that if we're looking at kind of building new systems, we need to figure out what's wrong with the existing systems. And for me, what was often, I think, wrong with them was a lot of inequity around how value is distributed. So in a lot of startups like culture, you don't have like the ability to invest if you're not accredited, or if you are trying to participate in a nonprofit or cooperative ecosystem. The actual process of setting it up is actually a huge pain in a lot of cases. There's a lot of like overhead to doing that. And I think with the internet, like and even just beyond blockchain or crypto entirely, there's a lot of interest in just how do we actually live and build value together collectively online. So we have this sort of like existing scaffolding of like countries and like companies that do this work globally, but what does it look like for people to actually just act globally and try and think about like their impact through group chats, through like other online forums, through random even just like calls that people put together, fellowships people put together entirely online. The fact that you can do all that is kind of independent from crypto, but it's the most impactful part of why like we actually care about the idea of instantiating some kind of value layer onto those kinds of systems, those kinds of ways we engage. And it's because of this contrast, like to your point of like why are we doing this, between these like traditional systems, traditional sort of like scaffoldings, like technology, like companies or nonprofit infrastructure or co-ops that are not meeting that need in a global context. So that's kind of answering the question without actually even really specifically trying to talk about crypto. Like there's just this broader conversation about internet native existence and community that I think we need to have.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. Perhaps I'll tackle this from a different lens. With UNICEF, we've been creating impact in over 190 countries for years. And oftentimes these are through traditional methods, initiatives, programs that are on the ground level. We partner with governments, other agencies, and so on. But in about 2015 is when we were exploring the Web3 space and blockchain and trying to think about what are some specific use cases in that Web3 space that can be applied to the work we're doing so that A, we can look at making communities more financially inclusive. Number two, we can account for greater transparency and trust in systems, in the way, even in which people are donating or funds are being transferred from sort of one entity to another. And the third part is around efficiency. And within the Office of Innovation, we work not only directly with country offices and governments that do work on the ground, but we also support financially and through mentorship other ventures and other organizations that are building open source solutions, who are ultimately also giving back to the community. So as we're looking at this entire ecosystem, the question became really critical about if we want to be a part and make a difference in this future digital or digitally like financial world, we cannot stay behind, and we really have to take some calculated risks of incorporating Web3 technologies in our more traditional work. And the way we do it, and the way my team does it, is by looking at smaller scale pilots, looking at MVPs, iterating fast. And we recognize that we can't do it alone. So we partner with technology companies, startups, with government agencies, and also academic institutions. So just to kind of wrap that piece up, in our case, with UNICEF, that impact was already being made in different countries, but through blockchain, we're looking at how can we scale that impact and make it more efficient and make it more accessible to everyone.
I think I'll build off of this point, which is that it's about having ecosystems that are moving at really different paces because of the size of their organization and because of their incentives. And a lot of the existing powerful institutions of our day that we have today are backwards incentivized for impact. And so I think that the reason ideologically why Web3 as a space is so fascinating is that there's this double learning loop that we're able to set up, where for one of the first times in human history, we have a coordination technology where we're able to say, hey, there's actually some new incentives that we're able to put into place to coordinate these different stakeholders that all want different things. We're able to say, what are those new behavior changes that we want to push with those incentives? And then really quickly learn and understand, did those behavior changes act in a collective way, or are they actually still competitive? And from there, go back to our incentives and change them in a really tight loop. And so at the CoLab, we were working with corporations and startups and non-NGOs, as well as governments, who had all of these different incentives to try and push forward impacts. And we had pilots and experiments that they were really interested in, but no one was quite biting the bullet and saying, like, we'll be the first to go and we'll be the first to say, we're gonna try this out and pilot it. And so what has become really sticky to me over the course of seeing 5 years of projects go out and launch is, how do you actually set up the initial incentives in a way where everybody has a balanced, not necessarily equal, but a balanced amount of equity or value that they'll eventually get out as these projects invest and as they have time to build value in the world? And so to be able to promise that and to be able to have that trust be embedded not in just personal relationships or really institutionalized old power corporations, to be able to say there's something in the future that's worth us building towards together is just a really, I think, powerful way of saying we have our existing legal system, we have our existing code, we have our existing ways of taking ownership and claiming it, but here is something else that we all are agreeing on has value in the future that can be unlocked, and in some ways is automated and also gets rid of a lot of overhead. So that's what drew me to space, and maybe it was the Tyler Durden moment.
Great points. So I think for my moment, I spent a lot of time prior to this current role bringing nascent technologies and startups and pairing them with corporate institutions. So basically supporting corporate venture programs and accelerators in the circular economy and climate market. I think what's very exciting specifically about blockchain and Web3 tech is the speed at which it can operate, as well as you're seeing here, the energy and community engagement sort of from the groundswell up that's possible with this new technology. But what I think is very important for us to keep in mind, and we're going to hear a lot of this throughout the week, is as we start to identify solutions that can scale and apply into traditional industries, it maybe is not as important to talk about the pipes behind the technology. It may not even matter if it's blockchain or Web3 or crypto. What matters is the pace at which we can access communities, make new markets, and drive innovation solutions at scale. So these feedback loops, these learning loops that Shuya is speaking to are so essential, but we also need to make sure that we're bridging into the language of our traditional incumbent industries so that they can understand how best to work with us, how to engage with the technology, and ultimately what benefit it's going to provide to them in the climate space or social good space.
I'll just add on the Tyler Durden moment, right? Like the climate space is one of those spaces where you're looking around, you're saying, who's gonna pick up the slack? How are we going to coordinate the governments, the corporations, the people? Like all of those things are coordination issues. And so shout out to Refi and Toucan and the folks that are here from that is, when you have a movement or a challenge that is as large as something on a global scale, that's not something that comes down to the responsibility of any centralized entity and organization. And so how do you use this incentive that you're able to customize for each individual kind of stakeholder to bring together?
Yeah, these are really great answers, and I think you guys are all touched upon coordination, that type of collaboration. I really want to get your input on incentivizing, right? Because maybe a lot of people might think impact is altruistic, but then we all know that good behavior can't rely on altruism. A really good example, right, with the refi ecosystem. I had led the special projects for F2 pool. It was like the largest Bitcoin mining pool in the world. And then when NFTs were getting hot, we got attacked. And we realized like 2.5 years ago that we need to do something. So we had purchased carbon offsets. We had done a lot of, we set up the working groups to do this stuff. And we quickly realized there was this sort of ideological dissonance between supporting altruistic projects. Let's use Bitcoin mining, for example. Yeah, I had started Bitcoin mining because we thought we could replace the banks. It's obviously not true anymore, but right now, many of the Bitcoin miners don't give a shit about decentralization, self-sovereignty, right? They're a plug-and-play part of the ecosystem, but because the system had been designed where they're incentivized to contribute to that good behavior, then we get all the side effects of decentralization and self-sovereignty, even though those players don't care as much. I'd be really curious to see, there's this good behavior that you guys have all defined, the collaboration, coordination, that can be directed towards these types of impacts and let's say public goods or public works and stuff like that. How do you think incentivization can help, right? Because the refi example, when Toucan and KlimaDAO exploded, right, no one really was paying attention to the climate market. Like the working group that I had fewer than 10 people. Now there's hundreds of projects, right? Klima had hit $1 billion in TVL, and then all of a sudden the Wall Street Journal was putting full page articles on it. Then everyone cared, right? There was definitely a money and incentivization component to what was being directed, and Evan, now it was like a Cambrian explosion. I want to hear how you guys, for your specific initiatives that are contributing to impact in the various domains you are, how do you incentivize it? Yeah.
I think that's a really important question. Ultimately, I don't know if this is on actually. We're gonna switch. Okay, we got one microphone down. The idea of actually trying to make impact, it doesn't have to be a fully altruistic act, and I think that's what people are realizing in crypto. It's something that people are realizing across different initiatives. I think this is why we start to see, and in our partnership, there's a lot of work around how do we encourage startups or other sorts of technology providers to participate in that process. For us, we try to incentivize people to give back, obviously, via donating in these quadratic funding rounds. But we also want people to donate to things that they think are going to benefit them. So in Ethereum, a lot of the early rounds that we ran resulted in projects like Uniswap or projects like Wallet Connect, some of which are here today. And those projects ended up being not just beneficial from the perspective of being public goods, they were also extremely profitable to a lot of organizations that participated in that process, and for holders, for example, of Ethereum in that context, who benefit from the growth of the ecosystem. So there's a question of who is actually sort of the stakeholder group that is participating in this process, and then what are the positive externalities that stakeholder group is creating beyond just their own local sort of area. And I think if you measure that, you can start to think about how to actually build more impactful ecosystems versus thinking about it purely in a charitable context. So I think that's what we try to do with the way that we're scoping each of the quadratic funding rounds that we run, and the way that we try and encourage donors to almost look for things that they might want to participate in or be part of in the future beyond just a donation. And that sort of is part of the community building exercise that leads to them being more engaged and feel like there's real impact in their work through the organizations that they're empowering. So that's a high level for me.
Absolutely, and to add to that, I believe that incentives are really critical in this space, because my personal belief is that, if someone is contributing to an open source project or volunteering their time, it's very likely that they are in a place where they're able to do that, and not everyone around the world has that liberty to be able to contribute to open source projects, and therefore it is our responsibility as a community, as an ecosystem, to make sure that those resources are distributed amongst everyone, and especially those who need it the most. One example of how we're looking at this concept of incentivization is, especially when it comes to contributing to open source digital public goods or just projects in general, is by leveraging the bounty program. So we know very commonly in the tech world, there are bounties that are put out, and developers or just people in general can go look at a bounty, work on it, and get paid because of the contributions that they make. What we're trying to look at is how could we apply that concept for the digital public goods that are part of the Digital Public Goods Alliance, because on one side, they have all these different solutions that are being leveraged at the country level, but perhaps they don't have the technical capability to customize them or to update them. And on the other side, you've got people who around the world have the talent, perhaps even have the time, but other than just feeling good about it, they're not really getting much out of it. So how could we bridge that gap? We're looking at that bounty program. We're exploring sort of the Gitcoin platform to be able to do that, so that we can have two wins on that front. And again, learn from these kind of pilots and collaborate with others in the community to see how can we further the sort of incentive model to distribute that wealth and distribute that influence across the board.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? So,
Absolutely.
where does the money come from to support these bounties? How do you determine ROI? Where does the money, you can't just donate money, right? How do you incentivize people to donate to these bounty programs, and how do they get a return on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking at different sorts of business models and funding models. Obviously, UNICEF has a venture fund where we have some funding allocated towards digital solutions that are open source. Obviously, there's an application that they have to go through, but that's one avenue. Another one is by collaborating with partners that are not only in that nonprofit space, but also on the technical front, also at that government level. Startups is kind of huge as well. And then the other part is when we're looking at digital public goods, while they may have open source solutions, they may also have parts to their work that may be not in the open, and that could provide an additional revenue opportunity for them so that they can start reinvesting that money within that open source arm or wing of their work. This is actually very timely because we are looking at how can we go beyond just donating and looking at something that perhaps may not be as sustainable if that DPG were to continue on their own.
I mean, I think that was amazing, and we're going to have a follow-up conversation about that. But I think one of the things that you mentioned, Daniel, is attention is also a very important part of impact, right? Like the social awareness of, there is a conversation around climate and finance to be had is just one way that shows up already. But I'd like to ground this in an example that may not feel like a digital public good or may not be something that we necessarily talk about a public good in a IDEO Collab venture portfolio company called Brain Trust. Not shilling, less shill, more shelling, but it's a fascinating model of that self-incentivizing positive feedback loop because in 1937, Roald Coates published this paper that was around the nature of the firm and was really about how markets are efficient for some things, but organizations are really good to coordinate overhead and reduce the cost of one individual player going out to do similar things. And now I think that theory has held up for quite a long period of time, but we're starting to see new software suites, new productivity tools that are really making it so that we have, one, the automation of the managerial class and efficiency for people coordinating and getting together to do what they want to do and the creative work that they'd like to do together. And then this additional part of it, which is after the pandemic and the lockdown, you have all of these groups who are figuring out how to tap into local markets of talent that are all around the world that don't necessarily live in the systems where you're expecting to see product and innovation design, trying to understand how do I get into these job markets that are highly desirable. And so what I love about Brain Trust is that they released a token in order to not only coordinate really creative talent to be able to be matched to and find jobs and careers that they love, but also in that token were given governance rights. And so now, without the extremely difficult overhead of creating your own organization, your own industry agency, and creating organizational overhead, you are, as a person, as an individual actor, able to access the work that normally comes through a larger organization that has the reputation and the brand. But because you hold this token, you are both incentivized to do a really good job so that the reputation of this overall organization is increased, so that the entire ecosystem is able to have access to better and better gigs. At the same time, you are allowed and have the power to change this organization to work in ways that are better for you and the career and the types of deals that you would like to pursue. So I think what you end up being able to do here in these incentives is not only are you saying the incentive that you have is purely monetary, you're actually saying the incentive that you have here is also the agency to change the container that you're working inside of and raise the actual value of what that governance token holds when it's listed on an exchange in the future. Or groups have been doing things like this, and organization models like this have existed in the form of co-ops, but never at scale and really never in a global view.
Christian.
No martyrs in the public good space. We tell that to our startups all the time, and this really applies to actors across every level of the system. So I think in the sustainability, climate, social good space, we've relied often on altruism as a motivator, and it's simply not going to scale and it's not sustainable. When we're looking at actors across the system, we want to understand it's not just capital. Of course, that's a driver. Of course, that's needed by many who are trying to bring and stand up solutions. But it's thinking creatively about what does every single person, actor, organization need at their level in order to speak their own language, increase supply and demand, increase market-making opportunities, make or save more money, and how does that relate to the climate goals or the social good goals that are at the table here? So it can go beyond capital into things like access to opportunities, access to conversations, access to rooms that may not otherwise be accessible, exposure, exposing the brand, giving a platform for folks to share their perspective, education, helping to understand, educate, and share learnings across different actors, and then finally capital, of course, is important, but we need to recognize that capital only goes so far. So there are other types of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators and incentives that scale and can really help advance folks in their work.
Great. We have a few minutes left. Maybe we can do a quick ideal world. What do you want to see from people that could contribute to the impact space? What would your ideal impact crypto/blockchain future world look like? What entities that would exist, people that would exist, structures that would exist? Do you want to tax people, right? What do you want to see?
Yes. But I think that the interesting part here is, there's no one solution to this problem. The goal of this is that we're building composable systems that anyone can kind of use and build together. If we have things like quadratic funding rounds that then are deployed for a given DAO that might be run using some of the sort of cooperative modeling that something like Gitcoin or Brain Trust or Uniswap or ENS are using, we can then start to think about, okay, now how do we use the money that those quadratic funding rounds get? Maybe that can be through bounties. There's a way to tie all these systems together and these incentive mechanisms together for particular types of problems with local with the local sort of impact that then hopefully creates these sort of positive externalities globally. That to me is the thing that we actually need to sort of piece together is what are those composable building blocks? How do they actually work together? And I guess the ideal form would be that it just feels extremely seamless and very almost internet native for people to use these tools in a way that doesn't require them to understand, as we sort of talked about, anything about Web3. They just understand that these are valuable sort of ways for them to enact some kind of public good and potentially even profit in the process. There's ways for something like a subway system or even public physical infrastructure to do those sorts of to create those sorts of benefits. And so I guess it's kind of answer one is you have a very smooth system of composable infrastructure that works, that isn't kind of known to people. And then two, you have a network that is both digital and then also instantiating physically. It's not just that we're doing this all online. There's actually a real physical community that is benefiting as well.
That was incredible. Thanks for that. I think for me, knowledge exchange is really big, coming from the world where not a lot of people within UNICEF would not necessarily know about crypto, Web3, and so on. I think it's critical for the audience here to be able to share their work, and then on the other hand, for us to also publicize what we're doing so that we can find synergies. And then from there could be more specific call to action areas like specifically contributing for a particular project, donating through these innovative funding models, or just looking at thought leadership and new ways of pushing that boundary forward.
I think as a designer, I want things to be more usable, just in general, better UX across the board. But I think that I'd like to see the entire space actually move from degen to regen. How do we actually think about creating more usability, more public good for all? And maybe sum it up as just like shill less, shell more. Like, how do you think about this is not your thing that you're working on, this is not your competitive thing that you're working on. So we really look at cyberspace as something that is an infinite frontier. What are the assets that you're creating that are able to be Legos and connect into the other things that other people are building so it adds up to a greater sum as a whole?
I agree with all those statements. It really is about collaboration. If we're able, in past work as we've done, to design pre-competitive collaborations across some of the largest corporates in the world, we can certainly do it in this space. And the reason it works at that scale is because those folks know that if you're trying to limit and control supply, ultimately you're limiting access to how large that market can be. And I encourage folks in the crypto and the blockchain space to also keep that in mind. Let's rise the tide, right, so that all boats can sort of float a little bit higher. A couple of other analogies, bigger pie, all of these things. But if we think about that now, we have the opportunity to build that architecture and those systems early in ways that actually can exceed and excel what we've been able to do at the large, incumbent, multinational level. Because there we're having to piece together all of these existing systems. We have the malleability at this moment right now to really think about what does collaboration look like now in this early-ish stage. We still are early. And then what's it going to look like at scale, and how can it match these large existing systems?
Thank you so much. And yeah, this is amazing. We have like the directors of IDEO, UNICEF, co-founder of Gitcoin. I'm sure they would be interested in talking to any of you if you have ideas, and yeah, please mob them after the panel. Thank you.